already knew as a Black person, especially a Black woman, that we don't receive or experience the same treatment in the healthcare system. There are extenuating circumstances that play a role, but the general cause is subconscious bias, which means no matter your financial or economic status, you're seen by the color of your skin. Serena Williams, world-renowned tennis player who has won 39 titles, including 4 gold Olympic medals and worth $180 million, almost died last September. Due to complications from her C-section, she was short of breath due to her history of pulmonary embolisms. She quickly alerted a nurse about her symptoms and was denounced as being confused from her pain medicine. Williams insisted not once but 4 times that she needed a CT scan and blood thinners. By the time the staff acknowledged something was wrong, several blood clots settled in her lungs. She went on to experience even more complications that were so violent that her C-section wound ruptured. With that being said, Serena needed at least 6 weeks to recover. 50,000 women in America deal with dangerous or life-threatening pregnancy-related complications each year. As stated before, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from said complications. Adriana Williams, who works in the corporate sector, has 3 grown kids, and is well educated, nearly died 30 years ago due to racial discrimination in one of Minnesota's clinics.
I want to share a story of an experience I had. I'm going to say this, right now I'll be 51 in the next couple of weeks. So this was when I was in my mid-20s. And I had a history of ectopic pregnancy. And when I went to the doctors in Apple Valley, because I've experienced some of the symptoms, that they turned me away because they were saying I didn't have the right level of health coverage. And the thing about it is that I did have, at that time I was married, and my ex-husband, he was in the service, so I had health coverage through his veteran services. But for whatever reason, they wouldn't take it. And so what they did was, they sent me home. And I had a history, like I told you, of ectopic pregnancy. And for those who know about ectopic pregnancy, it's like a tubal pregnancy in your tubes. And it's really a life or death situation sometimes, if it's not discovered in the right amount of time. I talked to everybody I possibly could. I tried to make phone calls because, we really don't have a true military base here in Minnesota to do anything I possibly could because I was scared. I was in fear. I was like, I got a young child at home. I'm experiencing this. They're telling me I can't come. They had me so shook and so nervous that I wouldn't go to the hospital because I'm like, if they're saying my coverage is not right for them at this clinic, then how will my coverage be right for the hospital? And I sure can't afford a bill at a hospital. And so I was like, well, maybe it's not what I think it is. And so I just shoot it away. The people there were so nasty and condescending, and I was like, wow, it's crazy that you can have somebody in the military serving the country, and here you need medical assistance, and you can't even get it. And then they just looked at me, all the condescending things that come with, I hate to say it, being a person of color. And then, they just think I'm, all the negative stereotypes that can go with it. And then you're also scared. So then you're trying to just self-talk and do everything you possibly can. I talked to the person at the desk. I didn't even get to the doctor. I couldn't even get past the waiting room. I could not even get past the waiting room. They did not care if I was really having an ectopic pregnancy or whatever it might be. They just didn't care. I didn't even get a chance to talk to a doctor. And, I did try to accelerate it and talk to the little administrative office. Still no help. So then I'd go home scared, saying, well, maybe this is all in my mind. You try to do all the self-talk stuff. And then the doctor, I'm going to say I was there probably for about 2.5 hours. And it was still like daytime because that day I didn't go to work. And my son, I think he had not gotten out of school yet, or he was in school because I went there by myself. And then when I got home, he was out of school. My doctor called me, well, I shouldn't say my doctor, but the doctor who did the ectopic pregnancy, Dr. Randolph, he found out what was going on somehow, which is crazy, but that's just the grace of God. And so basically what happened was he called me back. I don't know what he did, what favors he called in, or maybe he just said, you know what, I'll do this pro bono. I don't know how he did it. But when he came, he did the test, and he had to admit me in the hospital right away because I had an ectopic pregnancy and it was so big, it was the size of a quarter. I could have died. And I was trying to do all this preparation, him and Han, and he told me it was a life or death situation. So if I would have waited any longer, I would have died at the age of 25 with a young child when I had coverage through the military. But it's just scary. And I just don't know if my life would have been valued a little bit differently if it wasn't based on the color of my skin. But thank goodness for a doctor that cared and intervened. Or I probably wouldn't be here talking today.
Rebecca Polston is the founder of Roots Community Birth Center, located in North Minneapolis. She was a resident when her first child was born, and she and her husband both worked in the community as organizers. She then opened Roots to invest in the community, to serve the next generations of mothers and families, and to create access to quality midwifery care throughout the Northwest metro area.
My name is Rebecca Polston, and I'm the owner of the Roots Community Birth Center. I'm also a midwife. I became a midwife about 6 years ago. I actually had my start as a community organizer, but during my organizing, I was always interested in birth as a transformative experience. I had gone to some births as a doula and was really taken by the power of birth and the power of people's bodies, and realizing that for good or bad, whatever experience a birthing person had, it was transformative, either transformative in the positive or the negative. Now, combine that with my experience with community organizing, I really saw the experience that particularly African American people were having with reproductive health, with access to care and with outcomes. We are 3 to 4 times more likely to actually die in childbirth than our white counterparts, and that equity lens really fueled my decision to become an out-of-hospital midwife. I looked around and I looked at, again, through my community organizing experience, I looked at what the role of institutions were and how all of these institutions did not improve outcomes for people of color. More and more contact with institutions that were not designed for us did not improve our health. So the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result.
Rebecca says that cultural safety is just as important as medical safety. Why do we continue to go into institutions that treat us in a way that doesn't serve us? That pushed her to establish a center in Minneapolis, especially north, because of the historical disinvestment the city, let alone the state, puts into the area. She wanted to show and prove that we can have viable businesses that work for us and that work for all people in North Minneapolis. The main clientele at Roots is majority Black, making up 65%. 85% of the families that visit are interracial, with one of the spouses being Black. Roots is an intersectional practice. They openly affirm that all bodies are sacred and welcome GLBTQ and poly families. Rebecca is a fixture in her community. She stays ever involved by launching a new program where she will be taking interns from the local high school down the street. She also has an open door to youth, providing advice about reproduction and sexual health. Roots is also a training site, particularly for students of color, to feel safe and empowered on their journey in the field. Michelle Browder is a retired teacher, grandmother, and world traveler. She had an unfortunate experience after giving birth to her third child some years ago.
All right, so I began this experience of childbirth by going to Fairview Southdale Hospital, which is in Bloomington, Minnesota. So I was coming from Burnsville, Minnesota to go to Bloomington, Minnesota. And one of my good friends came and picked me up. I get to the hospital and about 20 minutes or so. And they take me right in. I had been there earlier that day, and they sent me back home because they said I wasn't ready to have the baby yet. So I was already stressed out because I had to go back home. But then I was back by, must have been about 4:45 p.m. So I get to the hospital. They undress me and send me into what was then called a birthing room. So this was about 31 years ago. So I go in the birthing room, and finally I had to wait until the doctor arrived. So I was there a little bit before. They were trying to make sure that I was comfortable, which I was. I didn't take any kind of medication or anything, so I just had the little ice chips. I had to wait until my then husband came in. He was all torn up because he was in such a rush to get to the hospital. He ended up having an accident at work, which tore up his front of his leg, but he made it there, bleeding and all. So we're in the room, and every time I laid on my side, my contractions would continue, and they were getting stronger and stronger. But then once I laid on my back, they weren't as strong. So the doctor kept having me turn back over on the side. So I go through the whole thing. I'm there probably for a total of less than 23 hours. I'm going through labor. Everything's progressing pretty well. No medication at all. I'm finally delivered at 10:54 p.m. So I got to the hospital at 4:45. The birth occurred by 10:54 p.m. They put me in a room, which at that time was way in the back, by myself. Everybody's gone home, so I'm the only one there. I'm really feeling kind of anxious because I'm in this room in the dark by myself, and I'm calling the nurses. I'm not really hearing anything. Finally, I doze off to sleep for maybe an hour or two. And then I just wake up suddenly. I don't know why I'm awake, but I couldn't go back to sleep. Feeling very uncomfortable with being in that room, in the dark, in the back. And I'm the only African-American person in that particular maternity ward at that time. So we're sitting there waiting for the doctor to come. Finally, the doctor arrives and says that I can go home, which I thought was strange. But I guess at that point, people didn't stay in the hospital as long as they used to. So I'm getting prepared to go home, and they come and let me know that I'm released, but the baby isn't released. And I'm thinking to myself, how can you release the baby? And no, I was released, but the baby was released, but I wasn't released. So I'm thinking to myself, how is that possible? The baby can't go home by himself. He needs to have the parent to go home. So I call my husband. He arrives there by 3:30. We're sitting there waiting. But I realized later on that they weren't going to release the baby because he had to have this, I think it's called a PKU test, to make sure that he didn't have any kind of antibodies or whatever within his body. The nurse is taking her time at first, but finally she's getting frustrated because the baby kept snatching his leg back. So she starts to snatch his leg. Then I have to act kind of crazy because I'm like, why are you snatching on my baby's leg? She's like, well, he won't keep still. He keeps moving. Well, that's what babies do. However, she was finally able to get whatever the blood test was that she needed to do, and we packed up and it was time to go home. But I would not want anybody to have that experience, because after having a baby, being in the room by yourself, it's not a good feeling. And I'm sure nowadays people go through much more of this postpartum. I didn't have that, but I'm sure had I taken the time to stay there a little bit longer, perhaps I might have gotten that.
This short film was made for all the Black women, their families, and their children. I made this film based on the staggering deaths and severe complications that Black women endure during something that is supposed to be momentous and joyful. I made this film to raise awareness.